Today's guest has spent 30 years across the US, India, and Southeast Asia. Co founded multiple companies as CEO and CFO, led NASDAQ IPO for two US companies, deployed over $200 million in equity capital. Here's why today's conversation matters. India has seen over $90 billion invested since 2018, creating 100 plus unicorns. However, India's secondary market is less than 2% of the global $130 billion VC secondary market. As founder and managing partner at Peachtree Capital Partners, Vinod Keni is launching one of India's first VC secondaries and special situations fund.
India can be a great experimental lab, right? I mean, we do have these challenges, as well, and that presents itself as a way for us to actually be able to come up with solutions and test them out here.
Hi, Mr. Vinod. Thank you so much for joining me as my first guest speaker on Unlocking India's VC Potential. This is a podcast I've been dreaming about doing for a very long time, and it's really an honor to have you as my first guest.
Thank you, Rohit, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I consider it a privilege to be one of your first guests on this podcast. And good luck with this. And I look forward to these interactions with you because all my previous conversations that I've had with you have always been fascinating, interactive, but also very illuminating because, I think I've also learned quite a lot from these conversations that I've had with you. And I look forward to more and more of these.
Thank you so much. So before we jump in, I'd like to little bit take us walk down memory lane, and I want to talk about explain to our listeners about your starting of journey from entrepreneur to currently as a VC. So when did the waves of entrepreneurship start with you?
So I never really sort of looked at it as a journey of entrepreneurship, right? So I did not come from a business family, right? I grew up in a very typical middle class South Indian family. My father worked at Bosch. He was a senior executive there. And I'd never really had that exposure that a lot of people talk about, those influences on entrepreneurship, right? Except for the fact that I had an uncle, a maternal uncle, who had actually sort of quit his job and had an entrepreneurial venture in the power segment, as well as a maternal grandfather who was a commodities trader, and maternal uncles were also in the commodities business. So there was a little bit of those conversations whenever I used to visit them, which sort of was very fascinating to me, right? The whole aspect of and the dynamics of how businesses run and how transactions happen, how people interact, and also the underlying psychology of need versus want, and how do you really address all of those. But I went into a career in finance because I was not that keen on a career in either engineering or medicine, which were the other options that were there at that time. And that led me down the path into finance. So, but when I was in finance, and because of the fact that I initially started out trying to do a CA, I came in contact with a lot of small businesses and also with a lot of entrepreneurs. This was India before the liberalization happened, right? This was
Yeah,
pre-liberalization,
yeah,
where opportunities were fairly limited. But it was a sort of a very fascinating insight and an exposure to me to learn about some of these guys, what they were doing, how they were trying to build businesses, the challenges that were sort of there. That started to fascinate me. Even then, at that time, you know, this was, let's say, 80s, late 80s. There was nothing about venture capital at that time, and we never really thought about it. But there was a lot of talk about entrepreneurship and how do you really build businesses and why is it different and why is it that there are certain economies that have done phenomenally well
yeah.
compared to India, which is sort of still struggling and all of that. So we did a lot of those kinds of, and that sort of got me more and more interested in sort of business as a whole and
Yeah.
the way businesses get built up, both large ones as well as the small ones, and then from there starting to look at how people sort of really come up with ideas and execute on building a business around that idea. And that's how this whole interest in entrepreneurship started. It actually started taking a little bit more of a personal interest in me once I finished my MBA. I went to the US, did an MBA. After my MBA, at
Yeah.
that time, jobs were not that easy. Somewhat of a similar situation, though it was not as bad as it is now. But there were not that many people willing to sponsor for green cards and all that, unless you happen to be an engineer or a doctor.
Yeah.
But I ended up actually working with startups at that time. That
Hmm.
those were the jobs that were available to me in the US. I ended up working with a healthcare company that had just gone public.
Yeah.
That sort of gave me a little bit of an insight into what the IPO process had been. They were not a bootstrap, but they were a company started by McKinsey consultants, and they had that little bit of that McKinsey process-oriented
Yeah.
approach, but it was by the seat of your pants kind of an operation, right? So
Mm.
that I think gave me a lot of insight into how businesses are being built in the US, and
Yeah.
that led down to me working with other startups, and I think truly the learning and the impact of this was when I started working with a startup called Homecom, which was one of the early pioneers in the hosting business, in the whole web business. And we took that company public. And their entity and their hosting business ultimately ended up getting, sort of bought into GoDaddy.
Yeah.
But this whole aspect of building that business and the kind of growth that we were seeing there on a month by month basis, the challenges of building that up, making sure the organization could support that level of growth, making sure that there's the right kind of talent that sort of comes in to actually help us build this out. And of
Yeah.
course, all the other resources, including capital that's required to actually fund and support this kind of growth that we actually saw there. So that, being in the midst of all of that, first as a controller and then as a CFO,
Yeah.
gave me a lot of insight, and it also gave me a lot of experience, both good and bad, in sort of seeing what is it that really works and how do you really build a business out. And I think I also was fortunate enough there to actually have some good folks that I could learn from, right? We had investors who were this very traditional old school investors who had made a lot of money investing through the public markets as well as in a whole bunch of biotech and other kind of companies in the US at that time.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of insights that they would share on how do you really build businesses up? How do you really deal with startups? How do you really sort of take certain aspects and make sure that they work? How do you really sort of, I mean, you're going to stumble, right? You're going to fail, you're going to stumble, you're going to fall. But the ability for you to actually then get up again and then continue to keep moving, what are the things that you need to actually be able to really look at? And some of the things there that I've learned have sort of carried me through, right? The importance of making sure you bring the right people in, the shared vision that everybody needs to be sort of willing to share in that vision and work towards a common goal. Um, Being able to think ahead of some of the things that could potentially happen or not happen, planning for that, planning for risk, but most importantly, the ability to focus and the ability to execute. Because
Yeah.
unless you have that, it's very hard to build businesses, right? So I think these have sort of shaped my whole entrepreneurial journey that I started out much later, of course, after that.
Yeah.
And but then this foundation of working with companies, especially a lot of these startups, been very early in my career, and also dealing with some of the more larger businesses as well. When I was sort of doing my CA, has also sort of I think given me a lot of insights on what is really important and what is it that we should really be focused on.
Exactly. So now there's a lot of chatter about India's positioning in the next 5 years, to be realistic. Especially next year, there's a lot of predictions and forecasting reports that position India as the real growth generator for the entire world. So, what is your take about that? You've seen India from a US perspective, you've seen from Southeast Asia when you were there, you've worked in India for the past 5 years. So, what is your perspective about India's growth story? Do you really feel India's up there? Yeah.
I mean, I think, see, this has always been the case ever since I think the 2000s, right? There is a lot of conversations about India and the potential for India, which is also part of the reason why, there are a lot of people like us who also moved back, right, to India. And when I look at it and I look at some of the other economies and other countries and what they are experiencing, there are a lot of positives in India, right? I mean, we do probably have a lot of things that are um, going on for us, right? A lot of things that are going to probably sort of help us with the momentum that we currently have in being able to grow this. But at the same time, it's not a walk in the park, right? I mean, there are significant challenges that we still face, and some of those are, you know, economical, some of those are demographic, some of those are geopolitical. So there are a lot of those as well. So from that perspective, I think the next, I would probably say 3 to 5 years are going to be fairly exciting times, but also interesting times in India. So there is definitely a lot of potential, but there are also challenges. But then when I say challenges, I also mean them from the perspective that those challenges also present opportunities.
Absolutely.
These are these are challenges where, entrepreneurs and businesses and others as well, could potentially participate in actually finding solutions for those challenges, which could potentially be fairly large opportunities. And I've always sort of mentioned this, right? And I may have sort of mentioned this to you earlier. India can be a great experimental lab, right? I mean, we do have these challenges, as well, and that presents itself as a way for us to actually be able to come up with solutions and test them out here.
Yeah.
And a lot of products or services or a lot of solutions that are developed here have the ability to sort of get rolled out into large parts of the world, right? And it's not necessary that it has to be only countries similar like India, right? It could be, you know, parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia. There is, parts of Europe and Asia as well. So there are, and Latin America, Northern America, and all that. So from that perspective, I think India can definitely be sort of a lab for a lot of these solutions that can get tested and then rolled out.
Yeah.
But where I also sort of see that we need to do a lot more is on the innovation front.
Absolutely.
We are not necessarily, and I think it's a function, again, maybe more of our culture as well as our education system in itself, that we are not necessarily equipped to think too much outside of the box. And for us to sort of think about crazy ideas. I mean, I remember conversations in my grad school with professors where they would sort of say, go think of crazy ideas or come back with some crazy solutions. And this was typical of the Asians. We all tended to be very conservative and sort of try and stick within that,
Box.
boundary or within that box that we have sort of set for ourselves.
Yeah.
Whereas there were some guys who were sort of at that time saying, okay, let's go colonize Mars, right? And let's go try and see if there are other planets out there types.
Yeah.
Now, that is what is needed. And I think that kind of innovative thinking or thinking about innovation and solutions is what is also needed in this country. And that is not something that has to come naturally. The only way is for you to actually be able to support and facilitate that and encourage that. And if you start doing that, I think, over a period of time, we can also be that. But in the absence of that, we'll always sort of be not necessarily the innovators that sort of brought certain things into the world.
Yeah.
And that's my personal opinion. And I'm sure there are people who will argue with me till the cows come home on why that I think is not the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in my opinion, and this is also again, there is a lot of innovative things that are happening. If you look at what startups are doing, what companies are doing, and all of that. But I still think we are not where we should be in terms of innovative solutions that we can actually really bring out there compared to some of the other regions of the world, which
Yeah.
do, I think, a much better job on the innovative side compared to us.
Yeah.
But
And
all said and done, I think we still are an amazing country. I mean, look, 1.4 billion people speaking multiple languages, multiple cultures, all staying together in one chaotic
yeah,
nation is not easy.
not easy.
But we have been able to demonstrate that, right? I mean, and whatever said and done, for a large part, we've been able to do this fairly well.
Yeah. And speaking about colonizing Mars, we have SpaceX bringing their $1.3 trillion IPO next year. We're anticipating one of the biggest IPOs after Aramco, I think. So, and you've had an interesting portfolio with Artha, where you had participated in Agnikul Cosmos, which is one of our flagship space tech companies out of India. So, any words about Agnikul and entering the space tech frontier with SpaceX coming out with the IPO next year? So it's a huge level in it's very visible level in terms of the distance between our startups and US startups. So
No,
yeah, anything
but
cool?
I think, see, and I think part of the reason why I liked Agnikul and I like some of the things, and there are, you sort of see this literally like what I would call as green shoots
Yeah,
of innovation happening, right? And I think one of those was Agnikul. And within whatever they were trying to do, what they were really building was something truly revolutionary at that, when they started out, right? And when I was sort of talking to my partner and the team and trying to convince them to make this investment, we also knew this was going to be a binary bet. Either it takes off well or it sort of goes down where our investment is down to zero.
yeah,
But more importantly, I think it sort of gave me an idea of what's likely to come. And I think a lot of this was again based on what ISRO had done and what the country was at that point essentially encouraging people to think and do.
yeah,
So to me, it had a lot of potential. It had the potential, A, because of the way they actually had positioned themselves as a solution provider and the business model around it, and how it was very appealing to a whole bunch of countries that also had aspirations to sort of have their own space programs
yeah,
and the ability for them to actually be able to do it in a very cost effective manner, right? So which is one of the underlying things that we always think about. Whatever we do, we want to try and make it cost effective.
true.
So from that perspective, what Agnikul was doing and the way they were sort of going about it was very impressive, and which was also one of the reasons why I sort of went in and backed it. And of course, there was a bunch of others around that same time that I looked in the space and the
Yeah,
so-called deep tech area at that time, and I still continue to look at a lot of those.
yeah,
But I strongly believe that they were a pioneer and will still continue to be a pioneer.
yeah,
And I think what they are doing actually has a lot of merit.
right. So, like coming back to now founders and investors in early stage, cost efficiency is a very first question is the first thing they're going to be asked at an investor's table. So, will this deep tech wave that's coming in forward, is it important for investors and founders to keep in mind about having a business model that is feasible first and then scalable, or scalable first and then figure out the feasible part? Because the US, we have OpenAI burning cash month after month, and it's okay because they're getting that kind of growth. So in India, we can't really have that ambition, and many founders find that kind of difficult to find a business model to to have a cost effective way to it. So what would you tell the next 18 to 20 35 year olds building in this space, and what to keep in mind, especially in deep tech?
See, I think it's not the question of, sustainability versus scalability, right? I think the question is, can you as an entrepreneur build a business that is capital efficient? Now, look, I mean, when what OpenAI is doing or what a whole bunch of AI companies are doing, there is very clearly, an awareness of the fact that there is going to be a fairly large amount of capital that's going to get spent, right? There's a fair amount of investments that have to be made because this is also one where there is a lot of experimentation that has to happen, which means that there are a lot of things that are going to be tried, tested. Some will work, some will break. You need to keep doing this over and over and over again till you get to a point where, this is also starting to work.
Yeah,
So clearly, when you sort of know that, you also then say, okay, how do I go about doing this, but in a more capital efficient manner? Which means I am cognizant of where I'm spending that money, where I'm sort of not spending that money, And to what extent can I actually sort of continue with these experimentations, and when do I really pull back?
Yeah.
And I think as an entrepreneur and as an investor sort of backing these, it's really important to sort of keep this in mind, that capital efficiency and the ability to sort of be able to match that and pair that with execution capabilities
Yeah.
becomes really important. So I can't necessarily then go and says, okay, I'm going to build a startup, but I'm going to throw a lot of money into customer acquisition. But then ultimately beyond that customer acquisition that sort of happens, I don't really have much of a business model, or I have a business model that I still need to think about, which is
Yeah.
fine because I
Yeah.
can understand if it's a new segment or something new, that we still don't know what those business models will be. We still don't know whether people are willing to really pay for certain things or not to pay for certain things. All of that, I think, is fairly known. But within that, how do you really go about trying to say that I'm going to still be able to build something that is sustainable?
Yeah.
And along the way, I'm going to be constantly figuring out ways for me to really build something, I think is also an important aspect.
Yeah.
And that I think is what becomes really important, right? It's again the question of being capital efficient
Yeah.
and the ability to sort of be able to scale the business up, but scale the business in a very sustainable manner. And I've seen a lot of companies, and I still see a lot of companies that are continuing to do this well, right? I mean, on one side, you do have companies who during the go-go days of the 2020, 2021, 22
Yeah.
raised a boatload of money because there was cheap capital available, but have been very conscious of how that money gets invested and where is it that I'm sort of investing and really building that up, right? So I think these become really important aspects for us to sort of keep in mind when you're actually building a startup.
Yeah. And the reason why there's a lot of people interested in coming back to India now with the whole H1B issue and the lottery system, and even European countries, and many people are coming back to India to build. So early stage is seen as a very attractive proposition for Indian VCs at the moment. So amid economic slowdown, what would be, according to you, a sweet spot, and what advice would you have for founders who are coming back to India right now to build, like especially first-time founders? So anything
So,
about that? Yeah.
so I think there are a few things to keep in mind, right? So one is, um, see, India, everybody sort of, especially when you're on the outside, everybody looks at India and says, look at the sheer size and scale, right? But in reality, that sheer size and scale is not necessarily something that is available from day one. We are, even though we are 1.4 billion, we are not necessarily as large a market as some of the Western economies are, right? And that is also, again, something that is cultural. We are very value driven, which means just because something is new doesn't necessarily mean to say everybody's going to adopt it. It takes time before people actually start doing it, right? I mean, look at the amount of time that it's taken, maybe like a Swiggy or a Zomato. But then, of course, there are things like quick commerce that sort of took off very quickly. But again, look at the amount of capital that's been invested in it. So if you're building something for India, keep that in mind that those numbers may not necessarily translate into large markets in a short period of time. It takes a while for you to get to any kind of scale, which also then brings it back to that, the earlier point I made about being capital efficient. Uh, Two, I think, is when if you're coming here, you should actually use this as a way to be able to build more for a global market rather than just only for an India market. I think those are the ones that actually have the potential to be scalable and sustainable over a longer period of time, especially if you are in a position to actually be able to constantly innovate and keep adding features or adding new products or whatever else, right? So build for the world, make sure you're capital efficient. Also understand that Indian markets are not necessarily, not necessarily going to be adapting to whatever you're trying to do in a much faster manner. And the other issue that I think you should also keep in mind is the fact that even though there's a lot of capital that's available here, that capital is still, I think, to a certain degree, fairly conservative compared to early stage capital that you would potentially find in other parts, right? I mean, the US capital markets, especially the private side, early stage capital, I think is a lot more open to risk compared to the Indian capital, right? So I think there is a little bit of that to sort of also keep in mind when you start really looking at building things in India as well. The other aspect here is the fact that it's a lot more easier to build overseas than in India. India, there's a lot of things to take care of, right? So here, certain things that you would potentially not really think about, a lot of issues that could be tactical in nature are things that you have to deal with here, which you may not necessarily have to deal with. So from that perspective, building here means a lot more effort, which also means that you need to make sure that you're bringing in a team that can execute. That becomes really important. And I think execution is something that is underrated here. We don't necessarily have that element that has, I think we don't necessarily get that training, at least over the last few years, especially with education systems. So it, building teams with execution capabilities becomes really, really important. I think those are elements that you need to really sort of keep in mind if you're looking at building anything in India.
And also, like in terms of the ecosystem, like you mentioned, the US is more risk. The appetite is quite high there. And in India, if we compare, what is the ecosystem and the kind of differentiating position startups can be in India? So, for example, like we have a leading food tech company that scaled really well, like DoorDash in the US. But in India, we had Swiggy that scaled as a disruptor through every business. So the way the same business model evolved in the US is so different to the way it evolves in India. So, like, what is your take on that? Like, how important is like an ecosystem and mentoring that like nurtures the kind of business that grows in the respective ecosystems?
So I think, see, one is India now, I think as the ecosystem evolves and develops, the startup ecosystem, I think, is now at a place where um, if you can actually build or if you can do anything in India, this is one of the best times to do it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of support from the ecosystem, right? There are enough mentors. There's a fairly, significant amount of capital that's available. There is regulatory support from the government, although it's not necessarily translating into making it much easier from an ease of doing business at the ground level.
Yeah.
But even if you sort of keep all of those in considering, one of the best times to actually build a business in India, right? So there is that ecosystem. That ecosystem, I think, will develop and continue to mature over a period of time.
Yeah.
We are not necessarily, we can't really take that ecosystem that we have and say, okay, are we on par with the US? We are not. But we will get there, I think, in a period of time. The second thing to also keep in mind is we can't necessarily take what has sort of been in some other market and try and plunk it and replicate it here, right? It
Yeah.
also needs to go through a fair amount of adapting to the local issues here, right? I mean, we have cultural issues that you need to sort of keep in mind. There are a lot more other issues to sort of keep in mind.
Yeah.
And, like I said, we are value driven. So there is a whole bunch of, issues and things that are more unique to India that you need to sort of consider and keep in mind. And so from that perspective, as this changes and evolves, those considerations and the localization and the adapting also becomes really important. And I think from that perspective, this ecosystem is developing, but it's developing well. I sort of see this all around us, right? I mean, there are amazing mentors, there are amazing investors, and the beauty is that there are people who are willing to work and
Yeah.
support entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So right. So now let's talk about what you're doing currently, Mr. Vinod. Really excited to get to that part with Peachtree and your vision for secondary investments and unlocking liquidity in our ecosystem. So just like I'd like to talk about why do you think India urgently requires a stronger secondary market in VC and particularly for liquidity?
So, I mean, I have been in this VC ecosystem, for several years. And when I looked at how I wanted to really build Peachtree Capital out, there were, and we have had this conversation earlier, there were, these multiple issues that I really wanted to address, because that was the only way for us to also sort of, I think, be a little different and unique, but also for us to actually be able to really seize the opportunities that I see coming in the VC ecosystem as we move forward, right? So the VC ecosystem, of course, in India is not as developed or as mature as the other markets are. So our VC ecosystem is maybe, if I really look at it, about 30, 35, 40 years old. But more from that perspective, um, there is there is always going to be this opportunity because the ecosystem here is going through a significant change. The global ecosystem is also going through a significant change. It's not necessary that it's not going through that. India is also going through it. Now, what that does is that also means that you need investors and you need liquidity options across the entire spectrum of an enterprise, right? Now, whether you're an early stage investor, whether you're a growth stage investor, whether you're a late stage investor, you're a public market investor, everybody needs at some point or the other liquidity. So, which also means that the secondaries becomes a very important aspect of that. Now, when I sort of started looking at how Peachtree has to get built, there were multiple things that became really important. One was the fact that we need to look at investing as capital deployment, but capital deployment from the perspective of making sure that there were returns that we could potentially see being above average or above market that we could also go back and talk to our investors about. That was one. Returns becomes really, really an important aspect. The second was the ability to sort of say very disciplined and very objective. We needed to think about all of this, not just from the perspective of saying, I want to be able to invest into companies and help startups and help entrepreneurs. But that also needs to have an outcome because you're ultimately looking at it from the perspective of saying this is not only risk capital, this is third party money as well. So I also have to think about it from the perspective of saying if I'm going to be a financial fiduciary to my investors, I also need to think about an outcome. So that's how Peachtree Capital sort of has come about. And that's how our goal of building multiple funds and being able to deploy across sectors and stages becomes really important. Now, one of the first opportunities there is the secondaries. And the reason secondaries really becomes important at this time is because the early stage ecosystem and the growth stage ecosystem in India has been sort of growing for the last 15 or 20 years. And now you also sort of realize that they also need liquidity, one. Two, IPOs are not the only, and M&As are not the only options available. Across the world, as the markets have matured, especially the VC markets, you're also starting to see the secondary markets play an extremely important role in this, right? So for us, this became really an important aspect to sort of say, okay, this is an opportunity, and this opportunity is going to be there for a fairly long period of time. And the regulatory challenges and the regulatory issues that are also coming and have come in will also sort of support the whole secondary transactions, right? So from that perspective, we started really looking at it and saying, let's start really building out a fund around the opportunities to do secondaries, both one-off secondaries, also look at secondaries with VC funds where there could be, LP-led transactions or GP-led transactions. So for us, secondaries is a very important market, but also an extremely important opportunity.
Yeah. No, like you said, like globally, there's been a huge transaction volume in secondaries. In the UK, I visibly noticed with Revolut's secondary exits. So secondary is an alternative to an IPO, and in the UK, there has not been an IPO in the I think the last 2 quarters. So in India, we have had successful IPO exits. We've had Lenskart IPO to name a few. So like this is a new way of getting exit without getting a fully exit.
Yeah,
It's like a
but then
partial.
again, see, this is again, so see, I mean, if you really look at companies and you look at how companies mature over a period of time for them to be able to provide the kind of returns that investors are expecting out of them, it doesn't happen overnight, right? It takes a period of time before companies get to that stage where those kinds of returns can be generated or those kinds of returns can be expected. Now, now that also means that a lot of these investors, especially early stage investors, have to wait for 10, 12, 15 years for that to happen. Now, for in a lot of cases that may not necessarily be possible, right? I mean, funds also have their own LPs, and those LPs investors also have their own timelines. So there is always this misalignment between when a company could potentially be able to provide that versus what the fund actually has. So secondaries becomes a way to actually be able to bridge that, where the secondaries could potentially provide that exit to an early stage investor, carry this for a period of time, and then see those returns then being, or the outcome sort of being provided by the company in about 3 or 5 years down the road, which can get harvested and harnessed by the secondary investor. So that's one aspect of where secondaries becomes a more compelling value proposition, is the ability for us to actually be able to provide these exits for early investors who don't necessarily have the ability to stay invested for a longer period of time.
Exactly.
Second is, of course, it also helps with portfolio rebalancing, right? Because you've gone and done this with multiple funds. You have a portfolio that sort of looks overweight in one segment or another, underweight in another segment. So how do I really balance this out? One way of balancing it is going through the secondary route, of where I essentially sort of then bring in new companies that if I want to, or take out certain companies or certain investments that I don't necessarily have to do because I'm not in that sectors anymore, and then sort of taking those out and then rebalancing the portfolio. So secondaries plays those roles extremely well, and more importantly, they're also in a position to generate the kind of returns that investors are looking for.
Right. And how do you see this trend developing now? Is the wave coming to India, the secondary wave? Like, do GPs and LPs and founders are looking for such an opportunity in secondary market? Are they actively sourcing? Because India is doing fairly well in the IPO side of things. So,
No,
is
but then again, see the IPO market, even if it is, it's not that every venture backed or every private equity backed company is going to go through an IPO, right? I mean, that may not necessarily be the case. So, having said that, the secondary market, I think, is going to continue to keep growing, right? I mean, we are one of the first ones in the secondary market, but the secondary market will grow. It's going to be fairly substantial. We are seeing significant opportunity, right? I mean, we are seeing significant opportunities both from a pricing perspective as well as the kind of companies that are sort of being made available through the secondary route. We are also having a lot of these conversations with GPs, with VC funds that are looking to exit earlier fund portfolios as they sort of go and raise capital for newer funds and continue to deploy, right? So there is a lot of that opportunity, and I would not necessarily say a wave, but it's definitely a huge opportunity in India. And I think there will be definitely a lot more investors who will sort of come into it through the fund route to look at investments. Because look, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a fairly large amount of money that has been deployed in India in venture capital. And some of those companies are at a point where investors would like to see some amount of capital being returned. And, that's where the secondaries can play a perfect role in being able to do that.
right. And just hypothetically giving you a magic wand over the Indian VC ecosystem, what is one thing you would like to see change overnight if you had a magic wand? Something in the overnight.
I would like to see, and I think it's sort of happening now. I think one is, I think there are more operator VCs now. I would like to see more operator VCs, more focus on not just the issue of just saying I'm deploying capital, but the ability to actually be able to manage that very effectively. And I think that comes from you having had operating experience, and I think that becomes very, very important. So that's one aspect that I would like to sort of see happening. And I think the one thing that I would really like to see more and more is celebrating successes of companies that have started scaling and becoming larger. We tend to celebrate investments, right? We tend to sort of showcase and say X went and raised 10 million or 50 million or 100 million. But we don't necessarily talk about what happened to those companies 3, 4, 5 years down the road. We need to celebrate successes, and successes are not necessarily just the funding rounds. Successes are when companies become profitable, when companies sort of get to the point where they're large enough and they're attracting, marquee customers, or they're companies which are now starting to see rivals making, bids to acquire them. Those are successes that we need to highlight, and I think it's high time we start doing that more.
Yeah, that's very well put together, and I think it's a very big turning point for a lot of founders in the space. So, any like one piece of advice you would have for founders to understand what really investors look today, and also like what your vision for them for the next 5 to 10 years in the Indian VC ecosystem?
So I would say focus on execution, but also I think it's really, really important to build a good team. And I think, bringing the right sort of people around you as an entrepreneur to actually be able to build a sustainable business becomes important. So showcase that. We sort of tend to highlight and we tend to sort of idealize startup founders, right? They're literally like our, you know, movie heroes who sort of single-handedly go and, vanquish and defeat the villain, and also, go and win over, whichever the lady is and all that. But it's, the world of entrepreneurship and the world of startups is very, very different, right? It's all a team effort. And we would like to see more and more of those, right? We want to see, teams that sort of come together that have the ability to not only share the vision, but also for them to be able to execute. That's one. Second is the focus on selling is really, really important. We tend to underrate that. Everybody, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people sort of highlight futures, what the product does, all the bells and whistles that the product potentially has.
Yeah.
That is not important. I mean, yours could be the most simplest product with only one, not even a bell, not even a whistle, but it could sell like hotcakes. Why? Because the founder actually saw a real problem and actually built a solution to address that. So from that perspective, and not only did he build a product, she built a product to address that, but was able to sell that effectively. So sales and marketing becomes really, really important. And evidence of that is how well you put your story together when you come and pitch and talk to investors. Because if you are a good storyteller, you tend to also be a fairly good seller, because you're able to sort of really be able to articulate what is it that you're really doing and get the sell and the buyer interested enough to buy that product, right? So I think these are important aspects to keep in mind. The ability to sell, the ability to be able to tell a story that interests investors, the ability that sort of you have a team that really sort of works together to make this happen. And doing it in a very capital efficient manner becomes also all the more important as well.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, waves come and go. People tend to forget what happened, 5 years from now, and they may probably have another wave where, whatever that flavor of the month at that time is, you'll get a lot of capital, and all of that will happen, no doubt about it. But the underlying nature of this business will be these elements that will always stay really important. The team, the product, the ability to sell, and being capital efficient.
That's true. Thank you so much for this, Mr. Vinod, and really your words of wisdom and the insights about the Indian VC ecosystem. And I hope to continue more conversations like this with fellow industry players. So before we wrap this up, the final question I have is just a fun one. If you were not in VC, what would you be doing instead, Mr. Vinod? Just out of curiosity.
If I was not a VC, I would have wanted to be, at this time, I would have probably been a travel blogger. I love to travel and I love travel. I mean, that's one of the things I miss is the ability to sort of travel the world, right? And if I had not done this, I would have probably been, I would have been traveling the world and writing about those experiences. That's one job I still envy. I mean, I know you don't make a lot of money in it, but you have a lot of fun because you're meeting people around the world.
True. Typical VC wanderlust. There's still an opportunity there, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, which is the reason why with Peachtree Global, what is it we want to do? We want to actually not just be focused only on India. We want to start looking at a whole bunch of cross-border opportunities, right? We're looking at Europe, India cross-border. We're looking at things in Southeast Asia. So I think those will always continue to be there.
Yeah. And I'll hope to round back for another conversation on your milestones you've hit at Peachtree. Rather than the funding talk, I would like to bring more conversations about success stories on my series.
Sure.
So hopefully, Peachtree's milestones, once they've achieved, I can highlight them on this platform. And thank you so much again, once again, for giving me this time. And it was really a very intellectual and interesting conversation. I hope we didn't bring too much of the VC frenzy here too much, but also give a broader perspective about our ecosystem and what needs to be done, what can be done, and truly inspiring. And all the best, Mr. Vinod, for Peachtree, and thank you once again.
Thank you, Rohit. This was really a pleasure. I enjoyed this conversation, and the questions you asked really made me think. It was sort of very, like I said, these conversations with you have always been very enlightening, and this one was as well. Good luck, and always here to support and help you. And if I look forward to future conversations about what we are doing, about the industry as a whole, about specific companies, sectors, because I think this is one of the best times. And from that perspective, always happy to have these conversations with you.